Good evening and welcome to the next in a series of webinars hosted by Yachad, the pro-Israel, pro-peace movement here in the UK. My name is Amos Schonfield. I am a trustee of Yachad, a former staff member, and I also represent Yachad on the Board of Deputies, which is why they drafted me in to talk about Israel and the diaspora with someone who's far more esteemed than me. I'm joined by emeritus professor of Israel Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, Colin Shindler. Colin, as well as being a professor, is also an author who's written 10 books, most recently The Hebrew Republic, Israel's Return to History, which was in 2017. Before I pass over to Colin and we'll start our Q&A, the way we'll do this is that you have at the bottom of your screen, if you're watching on Zoom, the Q&A button. The Q&A button, you can do one of two things. You can ask a question. If you ask a question in your name, we will potentially call on you to ask your question via video, which will be done by Maya, who is behind the scenes. If you wish to not ask your question by video and I will ask your question, then please click Ask Anonymously, and then I will be very happy to ask your questions. We hope we'll get through a lot of the questions in advance or throughout our session, but we may end up with more questions than we have time, and we'll have to leave some out. So, Professor Schindler, hello.
Good evening. Thank you for having me, as they say.
Thank you very much for joining us. So I wanted to start, we're here to talk about the Israel-diaspora relationship, and particularly looking here at the UK. The way in which we envisage that relationship is largely through sort of the institutional or communal position, with a capital C, communal. How has this position been formed, and can you lay it out? What are sort of parts of the consensus and what are not?
I think that after the rise of the Hebrew Republic in land of Israel in 1948, vast majority of Jews supported the rise of Israel. No doubt about it. They labeled themselves as Zionists, no doubt about it. Times change. The older generation who bore witness to the Shoah, lived through the rise of Israel, saw Ben-Gurion as the liberator, Hebrew liberation, the person who forged Israel. That, I think, ended in 67. After 67, you had Israel expanding to nearly 4 times its area. You had the rise of Palestinian nationalism, particularly in the 1970s. I've just been watching a film about Golda Meir, and it reminded me that in the early 1970s, I was in a room in London, and she said, there's no such thing as Palestinians. And in a sense, that symbolized the difference between generations. That for my generation, the rise of the PLO, of Arafat, of Palestinian national identity came about after 67. And at that time, there were several groups, very small groups, like Brera, like Siach, like the left-wing Zionist party, Mapam, that existed in London at the end of the 60s and early 70s. But it was the Lebanon War of 1982, which I think antagonized a lot of younger generation, the younger generation of Anglo Jewry, who saw that what was being put out in terms of explanation didn't match what was going on in Israel. The younger people reflected the people in Israel who opposed the war. 400,000 people turned out in Israel with Rabin and with Peres for a Peace Now demonstration after the killing of Palestinians in the camps at Sabra and Shatila. And that was very much a watershed. And throughout the 80s, particularly at the Board of Deputies, there were people offering different points of view. And at that time, younger people who related to Israel, but perhaps not to the Israel government of the time, and certainly not to its policies, the younger people became very antagonistic, I think, towards the board's Stonewall approach. It began to change, certainly, with people like Shmuel Feinstein, who became president. And with Rabin's election in 1992, the approach of the Likud to say that people who criticized the government of Israel were somehow anti-Zionist or self-hating Jews or Israel haters, that all fell away. As soon as Rabin was elected, Netanyahu sent 3 of his close aides to Washington to set up a lobbying group. And I can tell you the Israel embassy in Washington was not amused. So from that point on, the cry was, Israel is in danger. We can criticize. So things change. And, you know, all the way through until today, we're talking about annexation. You know, there's been a growing number of people who have who criticize privately, publicly, the policies of the Israel government. So the point is, you know, if they criticize privately, why don't they criticize publicly as well? Won't this mean something to future generations? One of the reasons I'm, you know, agreed to do this tonight is that I was impressed that 500 or 600 young people, kids, will sign a petition. And there's me, I'm at the end of my life. You know, I'll be 74 this year. And I thought my place is to stand with them and not to be silent. It's easy to rest on my academic laurels, but for me, it's important to perhaps throw out a few ideas.
And as someone who was a signatory of that letter, thank you. So this public versus private shift that you're describing, I think there's how has that changed? Because I've heard it a lot as well within the community that we must not air our dirty laundry in public. And you know, I think we're at a stage where through social media, everything is supposed to be commented upon. So has that line of public versus private shifted at all?
I think there are holes in the attitudes of communal organizations. Let me give you a couple of examples. I made a point of looking at the board's website today, and it said it supported two-state solution. Fine. And it referred to the JPR survey of 2010. I thought I'll take a look at this. And 78% supported a two-state solution. And therefore the board accepted a two-state solution because it was a consensus view, backed up by scientific survey, JPR, wonderful organization. I also saw that 75%, that's almost the same figure, opposed the settlement drive. I checked it with a survey that I've been involved in with City University. I was an advisor. The real work was done by Professor Steve Miller at City University, approximately the same figures. So what I don't understand is if on the one hand, a two-state solution is based on consensus, why is the opposition to settlements based on that same consensus? Why isn't that a consensus? 75% people opposing it. People have red lines which they won't cross, or they say they won't cross. Let me give you another example. In January 2001, the then chief rabbi, Jonathan Sachs, led a delegation of United Synagogue Rabbonim to Jerusalem. It was a time when the Barak government was collapsing. It was on its last legs. The Natan Sharansky's Yisrael Ba'aliyah had left. The National Religious Party had left. Shas had left. The election was going to take place within a few weeks, which of course Sharon actually won. Now, Sharansky organized a rally which he said diaspora Jews should support. And many United Synagogue rabbis attended that rally because they thought that Barak was going to give back the Temple Mount. He was going to divide Jerusalem. I don't see it like that. But that was it. Har HaBayit was going to go to the Palestinians. That's what they believed. And Jonathan Sachs wrote a letter to the mayor at the time was Ehud Olmert, who became prime minister later on. Jonathan said, not even a democratically elected government has the authority to abandon the prayers and dreams of generations. It doesn't have the right to cede the Temple Mount. I respect his belief, I respect his integrity, I don't doubt his veracity in stating that. I appreciate it. But the question is, it's still an intervention in Israeli politics. They were criticizing the Barak government. Why was it right for the Rabbonim to intervene in Israeli politics on an issue which was obviously very important and fundamental to them? And it's not right to intervene when part of the West Bank is going to be annexed. I have a feeling that one of the Rabbonim who was at the demonstration, I'm not sure of it, was the present one, Ephraim Mervis. Let me qualify all of this. I have the greatest respect for the Board of Deputies. The leadership of the Board of Deputies, mainly women, have done an amazing job. They're incredible people. They work hard for the community. The civil servants behind them are also extremely hard-working people. They work in the best interests of the Jewish people in this country. And the same thing goes for the rabbis. But they are wrong, in my opinion, on the question of annexation. And they are wrong on when it is right and when it is not right to intervene in Israeli politics. Let me give you a final example. Philanthropists. From 1988 onwards, the state comptroller in Israel kept a record of all diaspora contributions to political campaigns. The 1988 election, Charles Bronfman gave $1.25 million. They were coming to England, they were coming to the States, collecting money. What is that if that's not intervening in Israeli politics? It doesn't make sense. In the year 2000, the state comptroller got so fed up with this, the rules had been revised about giving, that they fined Ehud Barak's One Israel, that's the Labour Party expanded, that won the 1999 election. They fined them $3.2 million, you know, double it today. So if such people can intervene in the internal affairs of Israel, why can't we?
So you talked about philanthropists and sort of the political communal organizations. So we have, you know, there is a very clear sort of role, although maybe actually it's a very unclear role, but there is a role for organizations such as the Board of Deputies, JLC, the Jewish Leadership Council, Labour Friends of Israel, Conservative Friends of Israel, the ones that interact with government. And you talked about the philanthropists too. What is the obligation, or is there even an obligation for educational or cultural institutions, groups? You know, I'm thinking perhaps with my background, I'm thinking of youth movements, but also anyone that works in sort of Israel adjacent or Israel related areas.
There is, of course, hasbara, which means explanation. In many instances, it transforms itself into tamula, which is propaganda. There's a difference between the two. When I used to teach the Israel-Palestine conflict at SOAS, of course, I had my own views. I tried to teach it as objectively as possible and then leave the people themselves. They were Israelis, Palestinians, Jews, Arabs, Muslims, people from all walks of life. I left it up to them. Self-education is perhaps the most important thing. You can tell people and say, look, these are my views, but you should show them that there are different views. It shouldn't be an one-dimensional view. One of the reasons why perhaps this was an important issue for me. Back in 1982, the communal organizations just blindly followed what was coming out of Jerusalem, despite the fact that Huge numbers of people were opposed to the war, and people blindly repeated the statements and the slogans, etc. I can understand it, but it didn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense. And that's when I began to really look into this problem. So it's been a 40-year, perhaps 50-year approach. And I don't think it's fair on young people not to take them seriously when they have questions. It's not fair on them. It's not fair on future generations to give them a one-dimensional approach and say you can't ask questions, you can't criticize the government of Israel. By all means, I think the educational impetus, if I'll finish on this line, is to show that Zionism was perhaps the greatest force in the 20th century. We can divide Jewish history before and after, before the State of Israel and after the State of Israel. And Zionism was the most important motivating force for the Jewish people in the 20th century.
Oh, I muted myself, I'm sorry. I'm going to ask one last question myself, and then I'm going to pass over to a few questions from you in the audience that we've seen coming in. You finished on this point of an obligation to young people, and you said that also in 1982, there was suddenly an outcry from youth. And I think there's an interesting question here about generation, and I know that it's not purely a generational matter, that it's not to say that where you are in your life cycle corresponds to where you are in your politics, but there is something about living memory that I think is very interesting, and I'd love to hear you sort of think out loud about this. One is, what happened to that generation of 82? Many of them are many of them now leading our institutions, and how has that impacted them? And also, what does it mean that many of the young people today have a living memory that is really sort of about intifadas, is about wars in Gaza, rather than perhaps even just a little bit earlier with peace processes in Oslo? What does that impact does that have on the way in which they relate?
Very clearly, if you've lived through a period, it's your life story in a sense. It frames you. It informs who you are. I was born just after the end of the war, and therefore I didn't bear witness to the horrors. My parents' generation did go through all of this, and you know what happened during the Shoah was unimaginable. But times change, people move on. The succeeding generation, of the generation that lived through the Shoah and the rise of Israel, were distant from that, and were framed by different events, the post-67 events. My children, my grandchildren will similarly have different views. My children lived through the Oslo years. My grandchildren haven't. Let me give you an interesting point about how things are framed. In 1982, I was actually a member of the Board of Deputies, believe it or not, and I opposed the war. And I couldn't understand what was happening. I thought, who are these people, Begin and Shamir? Where do they come from politically? Who is Jabotinsky? And this started me on the road to exploring the Israeli right. And it led me into an academic career. So, you know, the books I've got on the side here about the rise of the Israeli right. You know, suddenly I've become the expert on the Israeli right, which is quite funny, really. But it shows you that events that take place in your life, which are meaningful to you, and you think about them, and you say, why did this happen? It does frame your life. It does guide you. It's guide your journey through life. And I'm sure that's the same for everybody in different ways.
Fantastic, thank you. We're going to first pass, we're going to take it to questions from the audience. How it will work is that I'm going to call on you, and Maya is going to basically switch you into being someone who we can see. So there'll be a moment of lag in that for everyone. So we're going to first hear from Steve Mendel. And whilst he appears, can I encourage all of you to please head to the Q&A and to ask lots of questions. So first we are going to hear the question from Steve Mendel. Can you hear us? Hello?
Just looking at the actual, my script actually, I've lost it for a moment.
That's okay.
If anyone else who's actually in front of me, around, also.
It'll take a moment, so to put anyone else in. So if you want, I have the question in front of me.
No, I think if you don't mind reading it, that's fine.
That's absolutely fine. So your question was, what changes do you think annexation would make in the relationship between Israel, UK Jews, and their different movements? And Steve, can you just explain what you mean by different movements?
Well, I suppose like, Orthodox, Reformed, like that.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Steve. The problem about answering this question is that, and in a funny way, it puts a spanner in the works in terms of what we're talking about today. We don't know if annexation is actually going to take place. Netanyahu has proposed annexing 20 to 30% of the West Bank as part of Area C, which is controlled by the Israelis, and it's also where most of the settlements are concentrated. The problem is that the Trump plan says this annexation should take place within the context of 4 years of negotiations with the Palestinians, and there should be a freeze on settlements where the Palestinian state will be. There should be no building in the area where the Palestinian state should be. This is the Trump plan. The point is, will Netanyahu take unilateral action in putting into force part of the Trump plan? Will he do it unilaterally? It's supposed to be by July the 1st. Will he go against Trump? The settlers are very worried that about the Trump plan because it puts a freeze on the settlements. So there are lots of unknowns, and the map is still being mapped out. So we don't know, no one knows. And there's differences between David Friedman, who is the ambassador, US ambassador to Israel, and Jared Kushner. Friedman has been very enthusiastic for more or less a unilateral annexation of part of the West Bank. There are differences between Gantz and Netanyahu. Netanyahu seems to tell his Likud followers that there will be a unilateral annexation, whereas Gantz says it has to be within the context of the Trump plan of negotiation with the Palestinians. So will this take place? Who knows? We have to watch this space on the 1st of July.
Thank you. I'm going to pass on now to Lord Beecham, who has a question here. Hopefully he'll be able to unmute you. Are we having any luck for you to be unmuted? We'll give you, I think that's not possible. That's a shame. We're going to pass on next then to Miles Webber, who put a question in the chat as well. That we'll just give a moment to be able to hear from him. Miles, you're live.
Great, thank you. Colin, I'm a Yachad donor, a supporter, a former director of LFI, and an NIF trustee, and a passionate advocate for a two-state solution. And I totally appreciate the call for action. But I'm also a trustee of the UJIA, and I want to challenge your view that Israeli educational organisations simply export the views of the Israeli government, which is what you suggested. At the UJA, we most certainly don't. We have all points of view within our tent. And I worry a little bit about this process and calling out those that aren't standing up against annexation as kind of proxy Likudniks. I don't think it's right. I don't think it's helpful. And I think what it's driving is the middle ground, the large tent, which is pluralistic, non-political space for safe conversations in the community. It threatens their continuity. And I think that's quite dangerous. So I'd welcome your views.
Yeah, no, I agree. I didn't mean to give the impression that the UJA didn't have a plurality of views. However, in the last 35 years, you've had the growth of organizations like the New Israel Fund, like Yachad, like the British Friends of Peace Now. You had people who were elected to office like, well, let me give you an example. During the Oslo peace process, you had a meeting of the British Friends of Peace Now, whereby the former chief rabbi, Lord Jakobovits, attended, and so did the former Israeli ambassador to the UK, Moshe Raviv. And they felt constrained not to say what they believed in public because they held public office. Why have such organizations like the New Israel Fund been so successful if, you know, we can discuss things in private? Why have they, why have 500 people signed a petition? Why are we having this meeting this evening? The point is, we have to think not in short-term possibilities, not in short-term keeping quiet. There's not, all I'm suggesting is people should say, we don't think it's a good idea that annexation should proceed. And you can add, if you like, at this point in time, the sky won't fall in. It won't antagonize people. If in fact the results of these scientific surveys, which have been carried out by the JPR and by City University, and if you have comments by people like Sir Mick Davis, who was a great patron of the UJAA, yeah, what's wrong? We are storing up trouble for ourselves for future generations by remaining silent. I'm not suggesting people should go to Parliament and speak to the Prime Minister. I'm not suggesting you should have huge demonstrations, enough is enough, outside of the Israel embassy. But I am saying, if you make a short statement, it will give a sense of hope, a sense of enthusiasm, a sense of inspiration to a lot of young people, including the 500 that have signed that petition.
Great, thank you, Colin. Thank you, Miles. We've now succeeded in having Lord Beecham join us, so please do take it away. Oh,
mute.
You're muted. Nearly there. Ooh. We're nearly there. I saw. Here we are. You're unmuted now.
Right. Good. First of all, thank you so much for a really compelling analysis of the situation. I would just like to ask really about the connection between this country and Israel, and particularly from the political perspective. I'm a Labour peer, and I'm anxious that the party's relationship with Israel and its counterpart in Israel should be revived, because it's pretty much dead and has been for some time. We have a new leader who is, I think, empathic to the situation, and I'm just wondering whether Yachad, perhaps in conjunction with others, but certainly Yachad, has been seeking yet connection, and if not, will it do so in the future? Because I think it will be well received, and it's a job that needs to be done.
I don't mind answering, but perhaps this is a question for you, Amos.
let's hear from you first, and because I'm not involved in the day to day.
Okay. Well, look, you know, almost 50 years now, there's been a settlement drive, first under Israeli Labour governments, set up security settlements from 1968-69 onwards in the Jordan Valley. They were different. They weren't ideological in the sense that they are now. You can't expect clear-thinking people in the Labour Party, people who oppose Corbyn, to keep on saying, yes, you're right, and to go along with everything. Let me give you an example. Margaret Hodge. Margaret Hodge fought a valiant fight against the Corbynistas and against the far left. And she stood up for what she thought was right. She called them out. Yet she has signed a letter against the annexation. You know, you can be pro-Israel but anti-Netanyahu. You can be pro-Zionist and yet anti-annexation. But the point is, unless there is a vocal voice from the Jewish community that says, we don't agree with this, you're going to lose more and more people. You're going to lose lots, not only young people, but politically committed people.
Yes, absolutely.
I think, let me say something about groups like Yachad and the New Israel Fund, the British Friends of Peace Now, and many others. They have provided a safety net for young Jews from falling off the edge of the cliff. They have provided a different way of identifying with Israel. They are doing, in a real sense, holy work. They are doing work which the Rabbonim are unable to do, which the establishment organizations are unable to do. You know, for all these reasons, communal figures who are elected, president of the Board of Deputies or whatever, they come and they go. And they do valiant, courageous work during their period. But they're short-term politicians. We have to look for the long term. And, you know, you have to find young people that are sophisticated enough to know where the lines should be drawn, to strongly support Israel, to be proud Zionists, not to oppose annexation, to actually reflect the reality in the scientific surveys that are carried out by City University, by the JPR. If we talk about representative organizations of British Jewry, I don't think they are representative. I think they're unrepresentative. You know, so this is the point I'm getting at.
I think the thing I'll add from sort of my perspective of being on the inside, one of the aspects of Yachad's latest strategy, which is now a couple of years in the making, is around linking together up-and-coming leaders, both here in the UK, both Jewish and not Jewish, with people in the region. One of the things that's very interesting watching Israeli politics from over here is how people use their sort of political leaders use connections in the diaspora as a sort of cultural political cash that they can sort of hold on to, and they can show their credentials. And one of the things that we've been doing through parliamentary delegations and through a lot of sort of meetings that now we can have online, but previously we would have whenever any of us would be in the region, would be to sort of suss out who are the people that we can be building connections with, so that we can have really powerful conversations. And you know, it's hard for someone who works, for example, in the British Labour Party, to be meeting the right people, the people who are going to be setting the agenda for the years to come, which is how we end up with a very sort of disconnected policy that the previous Labour Party was on the verge of having. If we're able to build those connections and those relationships, we're in a much better situation. And that applies also to Jewish leaders here, young Jewish leaders who are up and coming, that we can help make sure that they're supported in getting involved, rather than sort of, you know, perhaps feeling disconnected, which has happened to a lot of the people that I've seen too.
So the we that we're talking about is Yachad and other, you know, empathic organisations. So, I mean, we're not going to get that out of the Board of Deputies. Is it possible to create a sort of coalition that might be able to get together to address the Labour Party? I mean, there's a case for doing the same thing for the Conservative Party by those who, you know, will not entirely concur with our views. But I'm, my position, obviously, more interested in what we can do within the Labour Party. And I think Yachad could take the lead in that, but there are perhaps other groups as well that could join in. Is that something that you could consider?
I think that sounds great. And I also think that we should talk about this at greater length at a different time.
Can I just add one sentence?
Please do.
We often depict this in terms of left and right. I think it's much broader than that. Ivan Lawrence was one of those people. He was in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet, I believe. And he was the former president of the Conservative Friends of Israel, has come out against annexation. When Margaret Thatcher was in power in the 1980s, she was very close to Lord Jacobowitz, the chief rabbi. But both of them preferred Shimon Peres, the Labour leader in the 1980s, over Begin and Shamir. So if Margaret Thatcher can prefer someone like Shimon Peres, is she a wishy-washy liberal?
Fascinating, thank you. We're going to move on, and the coincidence in screen name is not a coincidence. This is my mother, and welcome to the Jewish community where this is the only place this can happen. So, Ima. Oh, and my dad. Hello.
Hello, Jeremy. Hello. Long time no see. Yes.
This is fun.
It's a good
Hi,
way
and thank
people, isn't it? Yes.
Thank you very much. We're both very much enjoying this webinar. I wanted to ask a question. You started from a very interesting place, talking about lived history. And most Jewish people living today were born after 67, I suppose, or short around that time and onwards. And so the idea of Little Israel doesn't exist in living memory. It exists for you and me, but not for many people. And so I find it very interesting that 75% of the Jews here oppose annexation, because annexation, you can argue, is almost normality. You know, it's just a few papers and formalities and diplomacies. And yet there is this thing. And my thought is that there is, looking at Israeli politics from the diaspora, is a different angle. And this is an angle of triangulation. So you have the Israelis, you have the Palestinian, and you have the diaspora. And so I think that the diaspora has a massively important role. But I think that one of the things is, in the same way that, you know, you are invited to have a relationship with the Labour Party, I think you are invited to have a relationship with Israel. And I think that's really crucial. And this goes to very basic principles, like, why should we oppose annexation? I don't think Israel remembers why. What's the point in opposing annexation?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. Look, I think that diaspora jury has a role. It's important that people state their opinion, sure. But ultimately, it's the Israeli citizen that has the vote, and it's the vote that counts. You know, I mentioned Jonathan Sachs before, saying that the Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, should not be given back. I don't think that was actually the case, but he attacked the Israel government. This is January 2001. He was rebuked by the minister for the diaspora, also an Orthodox rabbi, Michael Melchior. And Michael Melchior said, I respect your views, but at the end of the day, it's the Israel government who decides. And that is clear. Moreover, American jury, I think, matters more than British jury. These are givens. Even so, British Jews should have an opinion and should have a voice. Now, you're quite right in saying that the the further we are away from specific events, our outlook is colored in different ways. It's true. However, what is continuous though, what is constant, is that as Jews, we live amongst non-Jews. We are the other. We are a minority. Therefore, we have some insight into the plight of the Palestinians. We have an insight into the plight of minorities within Israel. So for these reasons, this is a way of connecting with Israel. We are sensitized to the idea of human rights. A lot of the framers of the human rights legislation after World War II were Jews, like Professor Lauterpacht and many others. This continues. I know young people who are human rights lawyers. Why do Jews disproportionately go into the law? So this is also a very important factor. Now you could argue, I've got a very good quote here actually. I took this out this afternoon. This actually relates to this. One of the interesting things about writing books is that you can put good quotes in there. Now, this is a professor, Charles Liebman, who was a professor at Bar Ilan in the late 70s. This is when I met him. He's an American originally. He was Dati, he wore a kippah, and he said this. He said, "The truth is that whereas diaspora Jews now share the classic Zionist dream of a Jewish homeland, they have no Zionist vision. Israel perhaps has a particularist Jewish meaning for diaspora Jews. It is important to the diaspora for its Jewish survival, but Israel has no universal meaning for most diaspora Jews. It is not integrally related to the variety of visions diaspora Jews may have of a different kind of world, a different kind of society, a different kind of social order. Hence, the diaspora is not driven to press Israel into doing anything different from that which it is doing today." That was written 40 years ago.
Thank you very much. I'm going to dismiss my parents in case they start arguing. But thank you. So we're on to an anonymous question that came in. And I'll add a bit to it as well. The question is, are we as diaspora Jews too wedded to the two-state solution when both sides seem not to support it en masse? I think it's very important to note that in the most recent elections and with the formation of the government as it is, the Zionist anti-annexation or anti-occupation left that seems to remain is the handful of emeritus MKs and one sort of offshoot Labour MK who didn't join the government. There's a very small community that sort of seems to hold the same politics, at least in the Knesset itself. So are we too wedded to it?
I don't think so. The crux of the problem, of the conflict, arises from the fact that the Jewish national movement and the Arab national movement arose at the same point in history, with claims over the same piece of land. I'm sure everyone here today would wish there to be a greater Israel. If the audience were all Palestinians, they would say, my wish would be that there should be a greater Palestine. If you recognize that there is another narrative and another claim to the land, then the logic is that there should be partition. Jabotinsky said during World War I that settlements are not the be-all and end-all of everything. This is Jabotinsky. In 1947, Hapoel HaMizrahi, which was the religious Zionist party, voted for partition. Before 1967, the National Religious were supportive of the idea of partition. It's what's happened after 1967. So that truth that there are two national movements competing for the same piece of land is constant. It remains constant. The logic is partition. Even the Trump plan, even Netanyahu's plan, is to have a Palestinian state and a Jewish state. Now you can criticize what sort of Palestinian state, sure, but the idea is partition. Even Netanyahu is not talking about Eretz Israel Hashlema, Greater Israel. He's talking about partition. That truth remains. That truth continues, and therefore the idea of a one-state solution, whether it comes from one side or the other, doesn't hold water for me. You could argue that once both sides have their own states, at some remote point in the future, if by consensus they want to come together and form a unitary state, and they vote for it, etc., and they all agree, then okay, that's something else. But you have to go through the intermediate stage of a two-state solution, because this fulfills the historical impetus of both national movements.
Thank you. We're going to move on. There's a question here from David Crickler. You have been, here you are, hello.
Hi. So, yeah, I'm just interested to get your take on the fact that a lot of the communal leadership organizations, they explain their silence on these issues by the need to maintain a consensus. But something that I think has been going on in the last few years, actually, is we've seen that the silence of the kind of mainstream communal leadership organizations on some pretty controversial issues has actually empowered a kind of far right fringe of the community, and is now also empowering a far left fringe of the community. So you see kind of Yachad, for example, being outflanked to the left. You see a kind of a group of very sort of hard right ultras making a lot of noise, polarizing the debate. So I'm just wondering if the actual silence of leadership organizations, their timidity when it comes to expressing, you know, their real views, whether that's actually undermining the consensus paradoxically even more than it would if they were to give a clear opinion.
Okay, thank you very much. I've just tried to write that down. Yes, there is a consensus according to the surveys of large surveys, scientific surveys, that British Jews support a two-state solution. There's also a consensus, because this is virtually the same percentage over several surveys, that British Jews oppose the settlement drive. So why is it okay to support a two-state solution but remain silent on the question of the settlement drive? Because they say it will divide British Jewry, which the figures, the statistics don't show that. They don't show that at all. The far right in the community wants silence because they want annexation. The Board of Deputies want silence because they fear it's going to create division and dissension and all the rest of it. So they both stand shoulder to shoulder on the question of silence, albeit for different reasons. So that's the point. They believe in silence, both of them. In one sense, you know, the far right and the Board of Deputies and other organizations share the same view that there should be silence for different reasons. Again, what will happen if they speak out? I don't think much. I think it may even help the cause of Israel if they say we don't support annexation. It will, you know, you had Lord Beecham, Jeremy Beecham here before. I'm sure he has a very hard time in the House of Lords and other people in the House of Commons trying to persuade people. And maybe if you say to them, look, Anglo Jury is opposed to annexation, they may take that in a very positive sense and say, okay, we'll adopt that view. We will support Israel, but oppose Netanyahu. Support Israel, oppose annexation. That to me sounds like a shrewd move. It is something that Sir Mick Davis has been pushing for many years. He's one of the few people that speaks out. Very important. Why don't people speak out? I don't think it's for reasons of consensus. I think, as I say, it doesn't meet the scientific facts. I think they're worried that it may create a nucleus around which the far right may coalesce. They may feel that there are donors who will move away from them and support the far right coalition, if you like. There may be people who will say, I don't need these headaches. It's going to be terrible. It's going to be, I don't need all the distortions. I don't need all the insults. I don't need it all. I have enough of it already. This is going to distract me from fighting anti-Semitism or attacking the far left or whatever. And I'm only here for a few years. Let someone else deal with it. That may also be. There may be, you know, politics is politics. They may play into the hands of a rival who possibly wants to use this issue for political capital. All sorts of reasons. But it doesn't make it right.
Thank you. We're going to got time for a couple more questions. This one came in on a message, and it goes as follows. If annexation were to happen, with a concurrent process of rights being withheld from any Palestinians living within the annexed areas, and the reality of a Palestinian state in the non-annexed areas seems impossible, is liberal or universalist Zionism as an ideology and vision for Israel as a Jewish state still viable? And if it is not, what should come next for those who adhere to it?
Yes, it is viable. Zionism used to mean Aliyah, going to Israel. It then became the intention to go to Israel. It then became a pro-Israelism, that you would stand up for Israel. I think Zionism today means changing Israel into Zion. That's what Zionism means. And it means having a universalist vision of Israel. The early Zionists that came to Israel came not only to build a new land, they came to build a new society, a society different from the ones they had left behind. This is what the Chalutzim of the 20s and 30s were all about. The figures, I'm trying to find the figure. Yes, here we are. Relating to the specific question, there was a poll in Haaretz. Again, I don't know how many people voted for this, so it may be a bit fraudulent. So, but it's the only one I could find. 30% of those polled didn't have an opinion. 30%, that's almost a third. 28% opposed the annexation. 11% supported the annexation, but with political rights for Palestinians. 16% supported annexation with no political rights to Palestinians. And 15% supported total annexation of Area C. Only part of it it's being proposed is going to be annexed. So we're at very early days as to how things are. We don't know what the map looks like. We don't know if annexation is going to go ahead. So in one sense, it's very premature to talk about this. But I certainly believe that it's not the end for Zionism. Indeed, it may be the rebirth of a new type of Zionism.
Amazing. Our last question we've got here, Lawrence, who will appear. Here he is. You are?
Hi. Hi. Okay. Hello. Hi, Colin. Thanks so much for your talk. It really was interesting and very thought-provoking. I think to some extent you've answered the question. Maybe you could flesh it out a bit more. The one I had two questions, and the second one I think I'll ask, which is the actual term Zionism, which has been in the course of your talk. You did say Zionism was the defining political movement of the last century, and you also said, though, which might be a contradiction, but I think not, that each and every generation, as it were, has a different perception. You know, there's the 1948 and 67, 93, and so forth. With that in mind, and also particularly considering young Jewish kids at universities, especially. I'm not one of them, as you can see. It's about 3 decades since I enjoyed that status. But it's the word Zionism, which has become so toxic.
Yeah.
Maybe for wrong reasons, but it's become like a touch paper. You mention it as if people think you're saying, I'm self-declared fascist. You know, this is the idea. As you know more than virtually anyone, the right wing in Israel has absorbed, if not cannibalized, the whole Zionist notion. Can the word be reclaimed back from the right, or should one say, okay, Zionism has done what it's done, and people misinterpret it, let's go to some different paradigm, and yet still say we support the state of Israel? How would...
That's a very, very good question, Lawrence. I remember after the 6-Day War, this is now over 50 years ago. I really feel ancient tonight, I tell you. You know, what did you do in the war, Daddy? You know, I remember having conversations at the end of the 60s with people and some young Jews about the question of the emerging Israel-Palestine conflict. And at that time, I did not mention the term Zionism because I thought it would put people off. I thought in the context of speaking to people, these were people on the left. In that context, I thought I shouldn't mention this because it will, you know, it's like a red rag to a bull. I changed my view, particularly when this whole thing about Zionism became equated with fascism or Nazism or whatever. And in particular, you know, I worked for Soviet Jewry in the 1970s. So I read a lot of Soviet stuff, and a lot of these ideas about Israelis are really Nazis in disguise filtered out from the Stalinist approach of the Soviet Union at that time. So I felt, particularly when I went into academia and I began to study Zionism and trying to understand it, that I thought it was a betrayal of Jewish history not to mention Zionism. Zionism was a profound movement pre-war and certainly post-war. And I think that people have to educate themselves about Zionism in order to convey it properly. You know, Ben-Gurion said that, I think in 1960, there's no such thing as Zionism. And he used the diaspora as a hinterland for acquiring political support and acquiring financial support. But I think in this whole welter of defending Israel, of rightly defending Israel in all quarters, people are not well versed in Zionist ideology. They don't know where all these views came from. Where does Netanyahu come from? What, you know, how did he form his ideology? His father, Ben-Zion Netanyahu, was at one time Jabotinsky's aide. You know, it's all this sort of thing. Where did Begin come from? What's Begin's life story? I've just been watching a film through it may be the Jewish Film Festival. There's a film about Golda Meir, It was, they'd interviewed her and they left the camera running. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. You know, how did people like Golda Meir, who was very, very hard woman, how did she form her views? Why did she leave Milwaukee and go into absolute poverty in Eretz Israel in the 1920s? This, I think, is fundamental. Let me say something in conclusion. I taught the Israel-Palestine conflict at SOAS. Had huge classes, people from all walks of life. The young Jews that came to the class were very few in number, and they came in dribs and drabs eventually at the beginning, because they began to see what it was like at SOAS, which wasn't, let's put it, it wasn't the flavor of the month. Israel wasn't the flavor of the month at SOAS. And therefore, they had to find answers in order to, you know, and people ask questions. They had to understand, they had to educate themselves. A lot of my Jewish students ended up working for the embassy, for the Zionist Federation. One is now leading the Jewish Leadership Council. One of my non-Jewish students ended up as the ambassador of an Arab country at the UN. And she wrote the best essays on Jabotinsky I've yet read. So you don't know where these things lead. You know, knowledge is important. You can't just rely on slogans, and you have to understand, you know, why we are defending Israel. What is the, you know, you have to understand Jewish history. You have to understand why Zionism arose. You have to understand why the 15th of May was different from the 14th of May in 1948. All these things are important.
Fantastic.
That's the drosha.
And I think it's also a wonderful place to close, to sort of that plea and that sort of request. So that leaves me just to thank you so much, Professor Colin Shindler, for joining us this evening, and thank you to everyone who has been here joining us on Zoom. And joining us on Facebook, where we've been live. And if you have enjoyed this, and there are a lot of questions that we didn't have time for, and in fact would very much enjoy our next session, which is coming up on Monday, this Monday, the 1st of June, when we will be in conversation with Ambassador Mark Regev. So if you enjoyed this, if you've enjoyed any of our talks so far, I hope we'll be able to see you then. Thank you so much, Colin.
Okay, my
good
pleasure.
evening.
I've enjoyed it as well. I didn't know what to expect. My first Zoom talk, so I hope I've been facing the right way, and it's nice to actually speak to people I know. I hope everyone is doing well in this strange situation of self-isolation. We will meet again. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye.